What's going on, everybody? It's JT here again with JT Invest in You, and we have back on the show Michael Cotton, the co-founder of Algomint. And for those that are unaware, Algomint is a bridge bridging liquidity from the Ethereum and Bitcoin blockchain to Algorand currently. So without further ado, let us introduce Michael Cotton to the show. How you doing, Michael?
Good, JT. How are you, mate?
I'm doing terrific. I appreciate you coming back on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Of course, that's not a problem. A lot has changed, and, all of our audiences have grown a little bit. So if you could just start out with a little bit of background on who you are and what the project is, and we'll move on from there.
Yeah, certainly. So, Michael Cotton, I started in the blockchain space around 2015, predominantly in the Ethereum space, of course, which was the only really thing to be involved in at the time. Really, really loved the tech. And I think for me, it was understanding that though the technology wasn't where we needed it to be, I could appreciate that it was the journey. I often refer to it as early internet. And then in around 2019, my business partner AJ and I really started diving into alternative layer one technology and looking at what the alternative layer ones coming to market were like, what the tech was like, what the teams were like. We went with the Solana team, Avalanche team, Near team, EOS, a whole range of other blockchains. And of course, on that list was Algorand. AJ actually studied under Silvio Micali at MIT, so we also had a slight bias. But at the same time, the tech was the strongest stack out of all the technologies we looked at. And on top of that, the team themselves were of such a high caliber. We also had the conviction in our belief that they could actually execute on that roadmap. So after working with them for about 3 months, we started actually working closer and closer with them, formed Meld Gold and Meld Ventures. Meld Ventures in particular is a venture capital lab, as I like to call it, predominantly focusing on pieces that were missing in the ecosystem, either through investment, acceleration, or incubation. And as a part of that conversation, one of the key things Algorand really wanted and needed was a bridge. And so we started building out the Algomint bridge.
And perfect. And one of the big things that's changed since the last time we spoke is the launch of your token, GoMint. And I know the last time we spoke that you were waiting on a launch pad to launch the token, but it did look like you just couldn't wait any longer and you had to launch the token anyway. So could you just talk us through how that went? From my perspective, it looked like it went really well. But could you just walk us through how that went and then what the future holds for GoMint and governance?
No, for sure, JT. And look, we were still actually really keen to use a launch pad. I think what we sort of found was we kind of got to the point where, the extensions of launch dates for launch pads had just sort of continued. And we kind of, after a few times of, oh, look, we'll just wait for it's only going to be another 2 months. And eventually sort of got to the point where we sort of said, how many times can we wait and say, oh, no, it's going to be a little bit later than we thought. So we decided, look, in the end, we actually really liked the concept of a multi-dex launch. Which it went mostly smoothly. We did have some issues. Thankfully, the dexes themselves, all the teams were on standby to help. We did have a couple of issues with actually LPing onto some of the dexes. But thankfully, the teams were on standby, and within minutes, they were in there fixing any issues, and we managed to get the liquidity open. So I think all in all, we were really happy. We knew it wasn't going to be smooth, but what does not smooth mean? It can mean a lot of different things. And in general, I think it went as smooth as we could be happy with. So I think overall, we're really happy with how it went. And then since then, we've really been focusing now on the rewards programs while also being conscious of emissions. So thankfully, with our partnership with the foundation, we've been able to do a lot of rewards in Algo. But we're now starting to see a little bit more rewards creep out and go in on things like folks finance, for example.
Yeah, that makes sense. Now, are there plans to bridge any other assets besides Bitcoin and Ethereum? I heard that there are talks of that. But could you speak a little bit more on that?
Yeah, and look, probably good to understand too is we probably don't consider ourselves a standard bridge is probably the best way to put it. So although at the moment it's the representation or Algomint's current functionality is really quite bridge standard, in reality, the long-term goal is to become more of this cross-chain liquidity network, where we're also looking at like-for-like assets. So this cross-chain liquidity and consolidation. So a USD is probably one of the really good examples, which is one of the big tokens we're really focusing on at the moment, where you can bring things like USD and USDC and UST, DT, DAI and a whole range of other tokens from Ethereum and wrap into a single USD standard on Algorand, where we actually then keep balances of those assets at different rates that you can swap also inside the basket. So you could, for example, bring USDC on Ethereum and actually receive USDC on Algorand or USDT on Algorand, or bring USDC on Algorand and receive DAI on Ethereum. So we think that'll actually be a really interesting mechanism to start allowing easier flow of that kind of capital. And on top of that, we'll then wrap into a single standard called Go USD. So you can choose to actually wrap the asset or receive one of the like-for-like assets out of the baskets, which will also reduce a lot of liquidity fragmentation. And we do see it a bit at the moment, like the USDC and USDT pairings don't really see a lot of volume considering their size. I feel like they're kind of counterproductive use of equity. If we can start to see more consolidation of those kind of assets, and before we start seeing 10 different USD tokens bridge and appear in Algorand, it would be great to put in place something like this that will help control that liquidity.
Yeah, that makes sense. Would the stable token and like XBaxed XUSD be included in the Go USD basket?
It's a really good question, and it's definitely something we want to do. So we're working at the moment, in particular, around what mechanism we'll use to manage that, because obviously the really key piece with that is how do we make the pricing dynamic so it is reflective of the true market value of the token. We really want to, because I think stability in these kind of tokens is something desperately needed. There's not enough happening in the ecosystem for a lot of these tokens to find their own utility that'll give it more stability. And we can see it at the moment, finding utility for the tokens at this early stage can actually be counterproductive because it creates additional arbitrage opportunities in the market. So we kind of really, we really want to see that take place. So we're hopeful we can do that. A little bit of the trigger there is size, because what we can't have is this entire basket gobbling up, trying to maintain pegs of the synthetics.
Yeah.
So we're really sort of conscious of how that actual mechanism will work to make sure it still helps provide stability to some of these assets, but at the same time doesn't compromise, USD, or doesn't end up leaving the entire basket in jeopardy because one token depegs in a really strong way. But the plan is definitely to do something of that nature.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I know a lot of us in the ecosystem, we watched on the Waves blockchain as USDN took a kind of a nosedive all the way down to I think 60 cents. It did climb back up over the course of the week to come back to its peg, but it was a very serious depegging, and that of course is certainly a risk with these decentralized stablecoins. I will say I do think that the stable itself from AlgoFi, at least they're really trying to find use cases with it. They're partnering up with Lofty AI, which I think is absolutely brilliant to allow users to purchase real estate tokens with the stable token, and I think that's just fantastic. Now, going back to your bridge, though, will the bridged assets eventually be moved on-chain and out of Copper's custody, or is that a more long-term business solution?
No, it definitely will be. So the key piece at the moment is really working around how do we decentralize safely. Sorry, JT. As most people know, bridging is probably one of the more dangerous projects to build. We're hyper conscious of it. We're also really conscious that even on the auditor side, they're still really finding their feet in teal and PyTeal. So we're quite aware that we're building one of the riskiest products in a new chain that is higher risk than normal. So for us, a lot of the centralization piece is more around us being conservative around the risk profile. While we really make sure we can build out a decentralized version that we feel really strongly confident in and secure in, which will most likely include something like state proofs. And the only reason I say most likely is it won't only be state proofs. We'll need to involve other technologies as well. A great example is state proofs are only going to work on EVM. At the moment, they're only going to be one way. The way back is actually more closer to an Aurora or a wormhole style bridging. So we're quite conscious this is not going to be a short-term solution either. It's going to have to be a long-term process of slowly iterating and slowly moving different pieces of the bridge to be decentralized.
Now that you kind of brought me to one of my future questions, which is what does the future hold for Algomint once state proofs are more, are they actually live right now, or is it still like being tested? I'm actually unaware of that.
No, it has been delayed, so
It's delayed. Okay.
it's delayed, so it won't be live just yet. Also, when it does go live, it won't be a usable version just yet. It'll still be a beta test for the moment. So it's probably closer to sort of second half of this year.
Okay. And how could you envision Algomint incorporating that technology? I know it's probably hard to theorize right now since it's not in its final form, but
Look, thankfully, we have a fairly clear picture of exactly how we'll utilize it. Because in reality, state proofs, and I don't know if everyone's familiar with how Wormhole works. Wormhole is actually the communication network. It's the actual communication cross chain versus the bridging itself. So state proofs are very very similar. So it'll replace that very similar thought process. So for with Wormhole, for example, Portal is actually the bridge. Wormhole is the communication channel between the chains. So in this case, state proofs will form something very similar. They'll be the comms channel between chains. So what that will mean for us is as we build a smart contract on Ethereum side and a smart contract on Algorand side, and currently we look at those in a centralized way and we monitor that data in a centralized way, the transition to state proofs would be replacing the centralized watcher or information broker, I'd call it, replacing that with state proofs in a decentralized format. So thankfully, it's not an insane leap in terms of you've got to sort of rebuild everything. It's just replacing one set of comms with a decentralized set of comms.
okay. I appreciate you breaking that down for me because it's such a vague concept. I feel like out in the ecosystem right now, it's really hard to for anyone to really pin it down for me.
Well, and I'll add JT if that's okay. So the
Sure, of
team
course.
the team at Algorand as well. If you can imagine with a lot of this kind of technology, it's not a case on day one they know exactly what they're going to do.
Yeah.
It's kind of we know what we want to achieve, we know where we need to get to, and then there's this road of going tackling each hurdle and tackling each problem, and there are little pivots along the way. So I think, and the Falcon keys and some of these other pieces Algorand didn't expect to use originally were pivots on the way to delivering on state proofs. So because of that, it can seem quite vague out there, more because, they're like, we're 95% sure it's exactly the thing we're going to do this piece. And then they get there and they go, wait, no, we've actually got to do it a little bit different. So a lot of the vagueness is more around, they're conscious of wanting to be absolutely certain of what they're building or what they're delivering on before they make different pieces public.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. Now, going back to the prior question, if Algomint successfully moves everything on chain and no longer goes through Copper, will users still need to KYC?
No, and we're actually removing that very shortly. So we're actually moving to Fireblocks, and so we're actually doing a transition, and then you will no longer have to KYC. So that'll be taking place in the very near future.
Awesome. I know there's been a little bit of a hurdle because of that, but it's honestly not too much of a hurdle though, because looking right now in the Algo Explorer, it looks to me that there is about 162 Bitcoin that have been transferred over to the Algorand blockchain and about 1,277 Ethereum. So it still looks like it's going rather smoothly.
Look, we're definitely, now that we're starting to see more utility and more degenability, I think is probably a good way to put it with current DeFi.
I like that word.
I think it's created a lot more reasons as to why you would bridge and deploy your assets. There is still a little bit, and something to be conscious of too is there's a really fine line for financial advice too, and for businesses like Algomint, we can't say go and do this exact route to maximize your ETH yields, but there's some really great strategies you can deploy out there at the moment to get some pretty crazy returns.
Oh yeah, it's a really exciting ecosystem at this point. I know the last we spoke, there was maybe one or two apps, and now it's just like there really is just so much to do, and there's so much more coming. So it is pretty exciting. To go back to our stablecoin conversation, I know you also work with Meld Gold, and we've spoken about this a little bit before. But with the risk of stablecoins depegging, there is kind of this itch to have something more secure. Could you potentially, or like, where do you see a gold-backed stablecoin or gold-backed or gold-pegged coin? Where do you see its place in the ecosystem? Does it have a place at all?
Look, I think it definitely does, and I think we're really conscious that we want to see it come to market in the DeFi space sooner rather than later. A lot of people, like, one of the more difficult pieces with the something like gold that's a physical tangible asset backing the digital, especially something like gold that's fungible in physical form, and comes in all different kinds of representations. And Meld Gold team have it across a network of vaults across 6 countries. The amount of work on the regulation side around actually having the physical gold be able to be digitized legally while also being safely custodied, it is a much bigger task. So the team had really hoped that they would be ready for a DeFi launch of the tokens this month or next month, but I think it's going to be more like July before they feel really confident in making sure they've got all the bells and whistles ticked off. But in terms of the tokens place, it plays a really important role because it also doesn't open up people in different countries to currency exposure as well. And we talk about this quite a lot. Being in Australia, for us, if we're investing and we're changing AUD to USD and then deploying even USDC into the market, sometimes we have a 4% gain and we lose 6% on USD. And I'm particularly not very bullish on USD, which makes it even more nerve-wracking. Whereas on gold,
Yeah.
I feel a lot more confident in at a minimum, its stability.
Yeah.
I feel like it's probably a stronger asset in these times, but at a minimum, its stability. So we definitely see it as an alternative stable coin that removes an additional layer of country-specific currency risk.
Yeah, it is funny that you mentioned that. I do share the similar view, but it is as somebody that looks at charts a lot. The dollar's been on a tear for like the last year for some reason. It's been performing really well on the global stage. I know a lot of us here in the States are like, oh, inflation and so forth, but on a global stage, it's still in very high demand by other countries, which is really interesting to see.
I completely agree, JT. And look, I think for some reason was the key words there. I think,
Yes.
Australia in particular, we've always been a little bit sort of, especially in these times, like Australia's performed really well. So I think it's been really interesting for us to kind of watch all that play out. But, I think especially being in Australia, gold just poses such a strong alternative if we want to actually be creating yield. So the dream scenario for the gold token is one that launches, and the Meld Gold team really build out strong liquidity in the ecosystem. It starts being accepted on the lending markets, and really it becomes an asset of utility similar to USD is the dream. And hopefully silver shortly behind that, because I'm a particular fan of doing similar kind of deployments with silver.
Yeah, that sounds fantastic. Now, going back to, the wrapped Bitcoin and Ethereum and so forth, can anyone unwrap or unmint these tokens, or does it have to be the user that wrapped them in the first place?
No, anyone can unwrap. So as long as you've got the token and you come to the platform, and currently, as long as you KYC, shortly not having to KYC, you'll be able to unwrap the token.
Okay, perfect. That makes complete sense. Now, I just want to let anyone know that is watching. If you have any questions or comments for either of us, just let us know. I'm keeping an eye on the chat, and we'll surely get to those by the end of the show. So, Michael, could you illuminate us on, the roadmap for the rest of the year? What does Algomint have in store for Algorand? Excuse me. Sorry.
No, you're right, mate. So I think in particular, we're focused on delivering new assets. We've got a lot of thoughts around what kind of assets. We want to see some different assets come into the ecosystem. So, things like Nia, things like Cardano, some of these other kind of assets would be brilliant to start seeing them come to life. We think things like Cardano are also really well poised for things like vampire attacks. I think if we can bring that audience into Algorand, we think that'll actually be really interesting. But on top of that, baskets are really important to us. And I speak to a lot of the other founders really regularly, and I think the ecosystem collectively needs to be really innovative in what we're delivering. I think we can't be repetitive in creating the same products in other ecosystems, because we're then reliant on the layer one tech to be the resounding reason as to why you would come here. Not that Algorand isn't incredible, and obviously I'm a really strong believer, but I think we need to be focused on doing everything we can to create really strong reasons as to why you would come and bring your assets into Algorand. So, a lot of the projects are starting to think about how they can be really innovative in the products they're delivering and create really interesting use cases, or really interesting yield capability, or really interesting ways to create collaborative partnerships to run different strategies. And I think that'll be fairly key. So with our baskets and how we're looking at those kind of mechanisms for managing the baskets, we're really thinking about how can we maximize TVL and Algorand, how can we create additional utility loops or yield loops. So I think we'll hopefully see a lot more of that in the second half of the year. And with that in mind, like June, July onwards is when we see a whole other range of products come to market. So I think that'll also be this next sort of big leap in DeFi usability will be June, July. So we'll be really focused on being ready for things like the USD token and those things for that period.
Yeah, everyone I talk to, it kind of seems like the alpha is on Algorand summer. That's for sure. Now, I'd like to ask about the recent partnership you or Algomint announced with Insure Nimble, the Nimble Insurance. I don't know too much about Nimble. I know when I looked into it, of course, it's trying to be insurance for DeFi. But could you speak a little bit more to that partnership?
Sorry, JT.
No
I don't know
worries.
why I'm coughing today. The So Insure Nimble, really interesting project. Why I particularly like it is I think decentralized insurance is a particularly fascinating area. There's, on a personal level, the concept of how they tackle managing decentralized insurance is super fascinating as well. Because, traditionally, there's things like police reports for stolen goods, like there's a whole process. And how we see that become decentralized is going to be quite fascinating. But the reason why we're particularly interested in it is as Algomint in particular becomes decentralized, and as we see things like DAO governance really take hold, ensuring the protocol will be a really fascinating piece of the puzzle that we're quite keen to explore and make sure that we're sort of a part of the group leading the charge on how that can actually function with something like Algomint. In particular, bridges are the most dangerous, one of the most dangerous products, as we said earlier. But a big part of that reason is because they are honeypots. And this is not trying to tempt anyone to have a crack at Algorand. Obviously, leave us alone. But it does create these honeypots where you see these huge piles of assets, and that's why we see with things like Ronin Bridge and their $620 million hack. It's because if you exploit them, you exploit them in a really significant way. And so for us, insurance becomes even more critical. And we actually looked at some interesting deployments of GoMint as almost a bond for insurance, which we haven't completely shied away from. But what you find and what we're quite conscious of is because you build this honeypot as a bridge, if you have something like GoMint token holder staking to secure that bridge and to secure or to guarantee the assets in the bridge, when there's an exploit of a bridge, it's not the case of, all right, we'll take 5% of the tokens that were staked. It would wipe the entire stake supply, which then means it's maybe not the most viable and sensible option. Whereas if we can work with something like Nimble and actually create insurance and insurance contracts against different pools in the bridge, we think that'll actually be really interesting.
Yeah, it sounds really interesting and certainly something the space could use, that's for sure. Now, we've got a couple audience members asking about the possibility of bridging things like Luna or Cardano. Is anything like that, or even Polygon, or is anything like that in the development?
Look, definitely on the cards. I think the things that'll probably drive us faster will be even like with Luna, looking at things like UST, in
Yeah.
inclusion of things like UST, I think will be really fascinating. But essentially, so people sort of understand, we sort of go through this process of trying to approach this really logically in terms of what we build, which is essentially looking at what are the 10 things we'd love to see built. On that note as well, anyone in the ecosystem, if ever wants to send us through any suggestions, anything you want to actually see happening, please feel free to send it through to us either on the Telegram or the Twitter, or get onto Discord. But essentially, we'll look at what are the things we want to actually build. We then look at the difficulty level. We look at the skill set within the team. We look at what we have immediate access to, and we look at what the return on investment for the ecosystem would be. So hence the reason why USD is such a big focus for us at the minute. We think we can bring a lot of value by creating really easy ways to get a whole range of different USD tokens simply to Algorand. But post that, it'll be really going through that list of things like Cardano, Luna, Solana, all these other different tokens. Near, we're really keen on as well, and looking at how we can bring those tokens across. And I think it's more the order that will be the piece that we'll be trying to work out what's the best order we should be going in.
Of course, and as you mentioned before, it kind of circles back to your previous point of the ecosystem needing to build out those incentives to bridge those assets over. So I appreciate all the answers that you've given so far. Now to move on to more broader conversation, how do you feel about the market at large, and why do you think Algorand, in my opinion, hasn't been getting the love that it deserves?
Look, there still isn't enough. Two pieces. One, there still isn't a huge amount you can do. So I know for us that are deep in it, there's a lot in comparatively.
Yeah.
But in reality, there's still a lot more that's needed to create real utility. And I think if you combine that with it's still difficult to access the ecosystem, it's that combination that I think is what has sort of held us back. The other really big piece, and I do talk about this a bit, but I'm not sure if everyone's aware of it, that there's almost no institutional tooling that allows large funds to actually deploy inside Algorand. So you can't multi-sig sign into almost any of the transaction types inside DeFi. Ledger is still getting upgraded to the pack team. Thankfully, have taken on the Ledger upgrade and partner with Algorand to deliver on that, which will be great. But you can't even secure your hot wallets with a Ledger for anything that's using the current AVM. Like it's at the moment that's a real issue, because what it means is any of the major funds that want to come and deploy 10 million, it's got to be in a single signature hot wallet, which just gets really, really nerve wracking. Or they've got to create, a multi-layered system where they're transferring it back and they're getting things like LP tokens accepted at some kind of custody offering, and then they've got to get them back out to go and transact. And then if you're on things like packs, you lose your rewards for that 24-hour period. Like it's really just not fluid and smooth at the minute. So we are seeing some big things coming in May that will help fix some of these issues, whether it be the Ledger upgrade or some other institutional applications that will allow for interaction with DeFi from a multi-sig or an MPC platform. That'll be a lot more crucial than people realize in terms of bringing liquidity into the ecosystem. I think the other really big piece is there's still hesitation around security in the ecosystem. And the reason I say that is time is the best auditor. If your platform stands up for 6 months and without issues, with a large amount of money there, that is, probably the best audit test you could possibly have. And we don't have some of the benefits of things like Avalanche that was able to have amazing projects from Ethereum, essentially port over, which meant investors weren't coming into a new ecosystem with a new language that was kind of abrasive in access, that didn't have tooling that allowed them to feel more secure in controlling their funds and then trusting new teams. With Avalanche, they were teams that were well known, well respected, built great products safely, that were porting over code that required very minimal adjustment to then be live. So it was quite a different scenario, and I do feel like we end up getting compared to a lot of those kind of ecosystems, and it's not really a one-for-one comparison. But post some of these elements crossing, I think it's later this year that we'll really start to see that growth. The foundation are also planning on a really strong incentive program in line with a lot of these kind of updates as well. So which I think is quite sensible, because if you're deploying huge incentives and the big funds can't actually deploy capital because they can't secure it, it kind of becomes counterproductive. And I think in terms of the figures we see now, we hit an all-time high for DeFi and TVL and Algorand, which is brilliant. Yeah. I saw someone, it might even be new JT, talked about the algo price as well. Had the algo price been where it was, that TVL figure would be far more significant.
Indeed, it would be at this point, I think, closing up on like 700 or 800 million or something like that. Maybe a little bit less. Yeah,
which is absolutely fascinating. So I think I think as we see these changes happen, we'll see a lot more flow in. But at the moment, in reality, almost all the liquidity in the ecosystem is diehards. Like it's people like us that live and breathe Algorand, and are always going to be the early adopters. But this next period should be when we can really start to see those floodgates open. And there is interest. There is a lot of major funds that deploy a lot of capital that are already starting to stake their flags, invest into projects, and starting to build rails around Algorand. So I think it's just a matter of making sure we get all these pieces in place, and we'll hopefully see that adoption curve really, really spike.
Of course. Now we have another audience question asking here, other than Algomint, of course, what other projects are you most excited about?
Oh God, that's a dangerous question. I'm sure I'm going to leave someone off that I should have mentioned, but
yeah, you don't like pick favorites, I suppose, because I don't want to hurt anyone's feelings. But if anything, you can list as many as you want. We have the time.
Look, I think there's some cool things I really want to see come into the ecosystem. I think we really need things like Yearn vaults. I think would be brilliant. I think auto deployment of strategies would be fantastic to have. I think projects like XBacked, I think, will obviously be great. I think XBacked will have some interesting elements in that it's a fully decentralized stablecoin, which does have some really interesting upsides. And I think the team there are also really brilliant. So I think we'll see some great products come out of the team there. I think we've also got some really fascinating like metaverse products coming. The team at Mantle, which I don't know if the name's public, but the team at Mantle are building some really, really cool stuff. An incredible team that have worked on, some of the major 3D worlds in the traditional metaverse space, let's call it, but the traditional gaming space. So that'll be really, really exciting. But look, I think in general, these pieces of the DeFi puzzle, I think, will be the most important. So as we see the expansion of the money markets, we see things like liquid staking become more prominent. We see more liquidity in the dexes, and we see things like synthetic stable coins, then with this layer built over the top of structured products such as Yearn vaults, or things like options, those kind of pieces of the puzzle that I think we're going to start to see come to life in the next few months as well.
Yeah, that is one thing that's lacking relatively largely in the ecosystem are any sort of derivatives. So, I mean, I know a lot of institutions love playing with derivative products, and there aren't many that you can utilize in the ecosystem. I actually don't know if any really. You can, of course, go long and short yourself with some of these lending protocols, but there aren't any derivative options.
No, look, agree, JT. A little bit of the reasoning too, like which I find it's useful if people sort of hear why. Clarity around derivatives being probably more regulatory dangerous has really become clear in the last 12 months or 18 months. Whereas when a lot of products like Synthetics is a great example, they're an Australian team and a brilliant team. When they first built out their product, it was super grey. It was kind of, the regulators were kind of like, we're just going to leave crypto alone. We don't know what's going on. So they had a lot more confidence in building and going, worst case, they're going to come and tell us to shut it down. Whereas what we're seeing now is there's a lot more clarity from countries all over the world that they are likely not going to be particularly fond of synthetic assets or derivative assets. So I think that's also why it's made it slightly harder to deploy new products in those kind of circles, because the risk profile has increased. And what it's probably meant is some countries you won't see those products come from. So the pool of places that they'll be deployed from, or the teams that would build them, has sort of shrunk through these kind of problems.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. And I did just check as you were talking there that the Algorand TVL actually did just pass its all-time high now, sitting at 274 million, which is pretty great. If you toggle over to Algorand, there's 367 million Algorand, which is pretty incredible right there.
Mate,
So we're getting there. Still ways to go, but it is great sight to see, that's for sure.
Look, and it is the start of what will be a long path, but
Yes, yep.
And one I'm excited to walk.
Yes, 100%. I couldn't agree more with you. And we've got a couple more audience questions here. Let's see. We touched on this a little bit, but without too much speculation. Now, where do you see Algorand by the end of the year, or even next year? Do you think we'll break into the top 10? I added that last part, but
look, it's a really good question. Like, this is a really crucial 9 months for the ecosystem. And look, if I talk on Meld Ventures side, we're putting a lot of energy. We're putting a lot of energy into actually selling the ecosystem in general onto some of the larger capital holders that traditionally deploy in DeFi. We think TVL and DeFi and Algorand, this is a really crucial 9 months for us. So, end of year, I'd like to see TVL into the multi-billion figure, and to see not just the TVL and the multi-billion figure, but to see it also deployed in a way that means the ecosystem is a thriving ecosystem, that you can actually come and you can live inside the Algorand ecosystem and do what you want to do, such as do a $250,000 BTC trade, which is not for everyone, don't get me wrong, I appreciate that, but more in the sense of it's that kind of utility that will mean we will see funds that are really happy to deploy large amounts of capital. And that deployment, it is a whale game, but it's those whales are what will create a lot of the usability for everyday users to be able to liquid trade things like
Yep.
BTC and ETH and USD and Algo and get significant loans at low interest rates because there's enough capital that allows for it. And we saw it recently, like just in the last 24 hours, the spike in Algo borrowing rates, and I think USD borrowing rates spiked as well, because there's still not enough capital in the market to really allow deep usability. And I think that, that's a really good example as to why, we do need that to take place. So I think end of the year, we really need to see TVL really grow. We need to see a lot of additional money flowing in and a lot of additional usability with the funds that are in the ecosystem.
Yeah, I mean, we're, one step at a time. According to DeFi Llama, on the 1 month, we are the top 7 chains in 1 month growth at 86%. On the 7 day, we're top 5, and on the 1 day, we are top 7. So it's looking pretty good. And our TVL market cap to TVL ratio is down below 18, and it started the year around 63. So all signs are great in that direction, but I do agree with you. There needs to be more built out in the ecosystem to absorb some of that capital. We saw at USDC on AlgoFi, I think the borrow rate got up to like 18% the other day, which was crazy. It is back down to 6%, so either people repaid their loans or supplied more collateral or something. But yeah, I do agree with everything you're saying. If anyone else has anything to add to the conversation, please just let us know in the comments before we get on out of here today.
Well, I think too, JT, like we didn't see as much algo into the DeFi platforms for governance as we would have liked. But I do think, there's multiple reasons. I think for number one, if we had $1 billion deploy into DeFi governance vaults, whether that be on Folks or whether that be on AlgoFi, they probably couldn't have done much with it anyway, which is not to say they shouldn't have done it. But I can appreciate that it gets quite hard. I actually spoke to someone who had looked at putting a significant amount, and they quite quickly realized they couldn't really probably borrow against it. There wasn't a lot of things that they could probably do without interest rate spikes. And that sort of created an interesting dynamic. So I think, this first DeFi governance layer is really the testing ground for this sort of next segment. Hone.fi is another liquid staking platform coming that's going to be really, really interesting. They've got a really, really fascinating mechanism in terms of how that product operates. So we are going to see some really great options around those kind of products for this next period. So I really think this is kind of the tester, because I saw a few people were a bit disappointed in the figures, but I don't think be disappointed. It really is this test period until we get to, the next stage.
Yep. And I know to some degree there's a lack of patience in the space, but I sort of like the slow and steady grind as opposed to a like hype fueled trajectory that usually eventually pops with a bubble. I feel like the slow and steady build is usually more sustainable in the long run. So I still have very high hopes for the ecosystem. I know some people are souring during this bear market, but I think that's just nature, really.
Look, there's nowhere but up for this next 9 months.
Yep.
So
Yeah. Well, not financial advice, everybody. We're just throwing
no,
it out there.
sorry. And look, I'm more referring to TVL. We're going nowhere
Oh,
but higher in TVL for sure.
I agree with you there. We do have a question here, which I found interesting. What do you think about bridging Algorand assets to other chains? Is that something that Algomint is looking into?
100%. So we'll be bridging a whole range of assets, multi-chain. So a lot of the strategy around this consolidation or this basketing is that cross-chain liquidity piece. So a really great example would be we have Go USD on Algorand and Go USD on Ethereum. The Go USD on Ethereum, you could issue with Algorand USD assets, including things like if we end up getting things like XUSD or stable. On the Ethereum side, you could mint also just wrapping Ethereum USD assets into Go USD on Ethereum. But the other piece, the reason that's important is, we really see this cross-chain liquidity piece being quite important. So you could actually come to the bridge and you say, I want to trade my Algo to ETH. And we're talking about Algo natively and ETH natively. And what that would mean is, one, you take your algo, we then look at what the options are to get you the best price in ETH. And that might be a combination of using Ethereum-based USD stablecoins inside the basket to acquire ETH and replace. So it just gives us a lot of additional options being in that multi-chain piece. We gain access to a much more powerful aggregation through these combinations of assets.
That makes sense. And now we have another question that's a little bit, I guess not totally off topic, but I'd say a little bit. It's asking, does Algomint rehypothecate the assets in custody? And I know it's technically copper, but I guess the same question applies.
Yeah, so they are held with custody providers at the moment. So they aren't reused or anything of that nature. They're all held static, ready for redemption. But eventually they will be smart contract based. There are some we really are going to have long-term issues with trying to make viable. A great example is BTC. Potentially things like Clarity might make it possible. We may see the ability for it to be fully decentralized. But there was likely assets like BTC or HNTs, one we're bridging soon as well, that are going to be in a similar basket where they will be a much longer roadmap before we could see decentralization of those particular assets.
Is that the Helium token? Is that what it is?
Correct. Yeah.
Now, how much do you know about Helium? Because I've heard about it a lot, especially in this ecosystem, but I actually do not know much about it. Is there some sort of connection between Algorand and Helium?
Look, there's not a direct connection between Algorand and Helium, other than a lot of major backers of Algorand have also been backers of Helium. So there's this kind of 1 degree of separation is probably the best way to put it. From Algomint's point of view, the Helium network really built the HNT token and really built their own blockchain, not to create an ecosystem. It was because they wanted that distributed ledger technology for the token itself. What it's meant is, one, they don't have plans around smart contracts anywhere in the near future. To be honest, I think it would be a struggle for there to be a reason for them to build some. But what it really means for something like Algorand is it has the opportunity to take ownership of the utility of HNT inside an ecosystem. Because at the moment, natively, you can't really do anything with the token. You really got to go onto centralized exchanges and do transactions. Whereas we're working hard with both Helium, the Helium Foundation, some of the major holders around bringing HNT into Algorand, creating utility like you can borrow against it, you can LP it, to really then go, HNT's native ecosystem is actually Algorand. This is actually where you live with your HNT, and you can do everything you would want to do in a DeFi ecosystem, because it won't be a possibility inside Helium. But if we can build that out inside the Algorand ecosystem, that we think that would be really interesting. The dream scenario of that is miners actually mine and it instantly bridges and it's issued into wallets as Go HNT or something similar would be the magical version of what we'd like to see there. But, part one will be bridge, create strong utility, and bring that ecosystem into Algorand and make it their home. And they, in terms of the user base, they're really well suited to Algorand. We actually think that they will really enjoy the experience inside the Algorand ecosystem. So we think it's a great place to bring them.
Yeah, I do agree with everything you just said. To wrap things up real quick, how do you feel about Algorand governance? I mean, I know we just wrapped it up with, I believe, 4 billion Algorand committed, which is the largest yet, about 59% of the circulating supply. There's been some debate in the ecosystem. I know I was listening to a space that Chris Swenner was on, and there's been a sort of a back and forth on people that sort of agree with the algo governance staking programs through like AlgoFi and Folks Finance, and others that don't and feel like it kind of detracts from the point of Algorand, that it was supposed to be more of a commitment and now it's not, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, look, I don't know how controversial my comments will be, but I'm probably not a fan of rewarding governance. I'm probably less excited about that piece. My personal opinion, and look, it's everything is a process. I think this was the start of the process, which I think all makes a lot of sense. I think where I'd love to see it ends up going is, number one, we look at rewarding node operators instead of governance participants. I think things like the Hone project, which have been working on committed governance, which I think is a part of really what Chris is talking about, the ability for people to be governing Algorand that really are believers, because there is this element of staking and participating in governance for the reward, and really the decision is not a part of the thought process. It's more of just this step to get your reward. I think rectifying that would be brilliant. You might have heard me talk about this before, JT. Solving governance structures is not an Algorand specific problem. It's definitely a global problem, and we haven't fixed it in thousands of years. But I think moving towards a model where it's more about committing and participating in governance based on people that genuinely believe and are genuinely putting a lot of effort and time and thought into what governance needs to look like, with that in mind, I think the complexity of what we're governing needs to also change in that same step forward. I think the ability for governors to actually be making decisions that are more meaningful, I think, would also be really useful in the long term. And I definitely appreciate it's not a today thing, but I think it'd be great to transition to more meaningful governance, less about rewarding those that govern, and we look at governance or rewards really being based around node operators and making the network even more decentralized.
Yeah, I appreciate that point. And I know I've seen it in the ecosystem a little bit today specifically, obviously, because it was the last day and the amount of rewards that estimation was finalized. People were like, are you happy with the 7%? And I'm like, honestly, yes, because as you said, it's not totally for the rewards. And now that you can still use your Algorand, you can get a wrapped version from Folks Finance or what have you. I see no reason not to, because you're participating in something much bigger than just these rewards. But your point is well taken about the node operators, because I do honestly actually agree that now that you mentioned it, never really put much thought to it, but it would very much so increase the decentralization of the network if node operators were incentivized. And I know the original thought process, or at least I believe the original thought process behind it was, well, they're so cheap to run anyway. Why do we need to incentivize it? But I think that's not necessarily the point. It's really to incentivize the decentralization of it, because that incentivizes its security. Do you know if they're actually leaning towards that way, or if there's any talk about that?
Look, I think it is something that will happen. My initial thoughts, and a few of us talk about this quite regularly, as to what we think it might look like. I actually think what we'd love to see, or the dream scenario, would be being able to stake against nodes as well, create incentives for those that are also staking against nodes, even though it's not a necessity with pure proof of stake. It's an additional security layer that I think could actually be quite useful. I think then what we'd love to see is sort of the dream scenario is then by staking and backing, you can also vote in governance, but you could delegate. You could say, what, I don't think I'm the best person, but I love JT, and I see he's flagged himself as a committed governor. I just want whatever JT votes, I would like to delegate my vote to JT. So I think it'd be great to also see some of those kind of things be built out as a part of this overall view. But I completely agree with you, JT. I think the point is to go to 50,000 nodes or something that's that is spread across the entire globe would be the dream scenario. And I think with that in mind, a little bit of additional work around what the tokenomics look like long term, I think is also going to be key. What does emissions look like once the pot of algos is out, and how does that actually really function?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with you. Well, Michael, this has been great. Is there anything that we haven't touched on today that you want to let my audience know about Algomint, or anything else that you're working on?
I'm sure there is, but I've forgotten it already. So we'll save it for chat number 3.
Of course, you're always welcome back on. Well, I appreciate this conversation, Michael, and very happy to do it, and hope to have you on again sometime.
Thanks, mate. Really appreciate it. Thanks for having me, everyone.
Of course, take care.